Last week, we told you that Carly Gregg was denied a new trial and her life sentence is upheld by the Mississippi Supreme Court. However, the Rankin County teen could eventually get out of prison. In the ruling, the justices clarified that Gregg was sentenced to life in prison, but not life without parole. More than 2 years ago, she was convicted of murdering her mother and attempting to kill her stepfather in 2024. Gregg was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment and 10 years for tampering with evidence.